Hey guys, so Alice from Alice's Beauty Madness, one of my besties here on YouTube, tagged me to do the eyeshadow palette collection tag. She tagged both myself and Meg, and I actually wanted to start off this video by giving a little bit of a shout out to my friend Meg. Those of you who may have subscribed to my channel in the past year or so may never have heard of her because she was a little bit MIA in the past year, but she's currently been back uploading a lot of videos, a lot of interesting content, and as usual, sharing her wonderful, unique personality with us. So I am going to link both of these ladies' channels in the description box below. Please go check out both of them, but especially Meg, because I think you may not have heard of her before, and I guarantee you're not going to regret going to her channel. It's a really interesting tag, but I have to tell you, I really struggled picking out the palettes to correspond to the answers, and for a lot of them I'm going to cheat and like maybe show you more than one palette because I just couldn't bring it down to one. Oh, and final disclaimer, this is going to be the Pat McGrath palette parade, so if you're not into that, just feel free to leave the premises. I used to have a very varied eyeshadow palette collection. I still have eyeshadow palettes from some other brands, but I've ended up decluttering quite a bit and selling a lot of my older palettes, and the brands that I have been enjoying the most, especially the one brand that I have been enjoying the most in the past 2 years in terms of eyeshadow, has been Pat McGrath. So a lot of my answers to these questions are going to be Pat McGrath palettes. Anyway, now that we are finished with all the disclaimers and proclamations, let's proceed to the prompts. So the first prompt is, if I could pick an eyeshadow palette in my collection that represents me in terms of a color story. I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anyone, but I'm going to pick out my Sublime palette from Pat McGrath. This is the Mothership 2 palette, because there is just everything that I enjoy in an eyeshadow palette in here. There is a green eyeshadow, there's this gorgeous bronzy gold, topper, sparkly, amazing flaky shade. There is something with a stunning green duochrome to it. You have so many options. I find this palette so... this palette gives me so much inspiration, and I feel like after so many years of using it, I can still come up with new looks that I have not done before, that I'm still going to enjoy tremendously. Prompt number 2 is to pick an eyeshadow palette in my collection that represents me in terms of packaging. Now, this threw me off a little bit on a loop here because I wasn't sure whether they mean the actual like box of the eyeshadow palette, or could we also include the cardboard packaging that some palettes come in. So I'm going to give two answers here. If I have to give an actual like packaging of a palette, like the actual palette, I would have to go with the Urban Decay Electric palette, an oldie but a goodie. I still keep mine in my collection even though I haven't really used it in a really long time, because I enjoy looking at the packaging of this palette. I don't know, I just think these like clouds of abstract, you know, shapes of different colors are just so pleasing for me to look at that I could just look at this palette forever and never get bored of it, even if I never actually use the palette and the colors that are inside. In case you didn't know that, this is a classic by Urban Decay, unfortunately long been discontinued, and I don't know, I think I'm going to keep mine for sentimental reasons even if I never use it anymore. Now, the second part of this question I wanted to answer, if I could pick like a packaging that is something like the cardboard packaging that comes with the Pat McGrath palettes, I would say all of the Pat McGrath palettes have gorgeous packaging that represents me, but if I had to pick one, it would once again be the Sublime. I'm sorry, I just have a thing for this palette. What I really enjoy about this eyeshadow palette is it's giving me Silence of the Lambs vibes. I don't know what's wrong with me, there's something fucked up in my brain. I think this is gorgeous and it represents me and my aesthetic, and I like looking at it. I don't find it scary or creepy, I just find it extremely beautiful and pleasing to look at. So there you have it. Prompt number 3 is to pick an eyeshadow palette in my collection that represents spring. And I had a bit of a hard time choosing an eyeshadow palette that represents spring because I just don't know what exactly spring colors are for me. But when I look at the packaging of this palette, I immediately think of spring. So for me, that is the Nabla Soul Blooming palette. Isn't that the epitome of spring? Look at how beautiful and fresh and, you know, nature returns to life it looks like. I don't know, I just feel like this is the spring palette for me, and I also think the colors that are represented here are pretty springy. You have these gorgeous corals, you have these beautiful like duochrome shades, you have some beautiful bronzy browns, and you have these pops of blue and purple in here, which I really enjoy. I think this is a really beautiful palette, and I blame myself for being so stupid and not using it more often. So I actually need to get my shit together and do another shop my stash video and pull out the Soul Blooming palette from Nabla. Prompt number 4. Pick an eyeshadow palette in my collection that represents happy. And for me, I think when I think of all the palettes that I have, the palette that always makes me happy to look at, because it's so vibrant and so summery, it lifts my mood immediately, it immediately makes me think of sunny days and cocktails on the beach, and that is my Divine Rose 2 palette from Pat McGrath Labs, which I coincidentally am also wearing today in a look that I have already filmed. So if you'd like to check out how I created this look, you can watch this video. But yeah, to me the Divine Rose 2 palette is sheer happiness. Look at all these fun colors. You have this gorgeous, stunning multi-chrome shade here, not only in terms of its multi-chromeness but also in terms of its formula. You have these two shades here. This is my favorite gold from Pat McGrath Labs. It's just, there is something about this gold that no other gold can really measure up to it. This beautiful orangey bronze shade, this topper shade, this shade here. This palette makes me truly happy. Whenever I feel like I lack a little bit of color and happiness in my life, I am going to pull out my Divine Rose 2 palette. Prompt number 5. If I would pick an eyeshadow palette in my collection that represents the dark and grungy me. Now, if you know my makeup style, I'm not a very dark and grungy person, but when I do think of a palette in my collection that represents grungy, two come to mind immediately. And the first one is an oldie but a goodie, the Subculture palette from Anastasia Beverly Hills, because it contains some of the colors that I would consider grungy and use a lot if I want to go for that type of look. And those are, for instance, this mustardy shade here, this very khaki green over here, this beautiful deep forest green shade. This palette is to me the ultimate grungy palette, and I think 99% of the other people out there on YouTube. But if I have to think of a palette that I actually use more often, and I think those are the grungy looks that represent me the best, it really depends on how you interpret grungy. To me, grungy is mustardy, bronzy, warm brown looks. So if I have to think of looks that I can create which I would qualify on me as grungy, the palette that comes immediately to mind is the Melt Cosmetics Rust palette. I absolutely love this palette. It is just such a stunning release from the brand. I think when I do a look where I have this shade in my inner corners, this shade in the outer part of my lid, paired with a bunch of the brownie mattes, that sort of gold, very warm brown smoky eye, is what I would consider the ultimate grungy look on myself. Question number 6. If I would pick an eyeshadow palette in my collection that represents the girly me. And this one really threw me off for a loop there, because I don't really know whether I have a lot of truly girly eyeshadow palettes in my collection, and I kind of had narrowed it down to 3. And I'm going to show you the one that I picked, but I'm going to mention the other 2 because I feel like those are also very girly and also represent me quite well in terms of how I feel girly. So the eyeshadow palette that I went with is Fleur Fantasia from Pat McGrath Labs, because of these soft pastel colors and the way that it looks very girly on me. If I could pick an eyeshadow palette that I would kind of glue to this one as an extension of it and consider it also as a very girly palette, I would have to go for the Eternal Eden quad, and mostly because of the two soft pinks over here. So if I could create one girly, ultimate girly eyeshadow palette for myself, it would be an amalgamation of these two eyeshadow palettes. So that would be Fleur Fantasia and the Eternal Eden quads. The reason I chose Fleur Fantasia as the ultimate answer to this question though is because I feel like it's such a versatile and still very soft eyeshadow palette, because you have this these very satiny shades over here, you have this gorgeous, very muted pink peach matte shade, and you can still have quite a bit of fun if you pop this gorgeous duochrome over here. Okay, last but one prompt. If I could pick an eyeshadow palette in my collection that represents fun. That one was also a really difficult one, because there are a lot of eyeshadow palettes in my collection that I would call fun, including the Divine Rose 2 palette that I showed you earlier. But I decided to go for my Mothership 3 Subversive palette, because isn't this fun. Look at all these fun shades. You got that gorgeous antique green gold, you have that beautiful purple duochrome, you have this gorgeous VR pink shifter shade, you have a gunmetal gray, you have this incredibly beautiful magenta purple here. It's just, this is such a fun palette. Actually, this is also a palette that I would consider to be like a grungy side of me, but a different grungy side of me. So I would say the Subversive palette is fun. If you're looking for a palette that will inspire you and that will be super fun and that will take you in directions and, you know, paths that you never even imagined, then Subversive is the palette for you. And last but not least, we have reached the ending of this tag and we have one more prompt left, and that is prompt number 8. If I would pick an eyeshadow palette in my collection that represents inspiration. I'd have to say all of my Pat McGrath palettes inspire me tremendously, but if I have to pick one, I would have to go with the Decadence palette. This is the Mothership 4, which only contains metallic shades. I think this palette is just... There is so much unexplored potential in this palette. Every time I dip into it, I think, oh, but I can pair this shade and this shade, or I can pull this shade out from here and one of the toppers from other palettes and just create something completely like new and surprising even for myself. Like this spring, I found out that I can use this shade and layer lavendering on top of it to create one of my most favorite duochrome type eyeshadows. You have all these like different pops of color and you can always pair them in different ways to create something new. You can layer them together to even create new like hues of eyeshadow. So if I had to pick one, I would say the Decadence palette is definitely a huge source of inspiration in my Pat McGrath palette collection. Whew. And with this, we have concluded the tag, you guys. I'm going to like kind of think about who I would like to tag and also check whether they haven't already done this video, because I think a lot of people have already done it. But if you're watching this video and you're a YouTube creator and you have not done this yet, please feel tagged by me. I would love it if you let me know that you did this video so that I can watch it. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in my next video. Bye!